Not all wisdom comes from books or years lived. The midday sun was scorching the dry land of Red Canyon as Samuel Mackenzie stopped his wagon at the entrance to town. At the age of 52, he carried on his back the weight of 2 decades of trading with the local tribes. His faded blue eyes knew every trail of that territory, every dry stream, every solitary tree that served as a landmark for travelers. Mackenzie had learned the language of the natives out of necessity, but over time he discovered that it was more than commerce. It was mutual respect. The city was buzzing with strange energy that morning. Men huddled on the balconies of the establishments, whispering to each other as they observed something in the center of the main square. Mackenzie got off the wagon and tied the reins to the nearest post. The smell of sweat and tension hung in the hot air. It was then that he saw the origin of all that agitation. A native child, not more than 12 years old, was standing in the middle of the main street. He wore simple leather clothes and had his black hair tied up by a red ribbon. In his small hands, he held a bow made of light wood, polished by constant use. Beside him, on the dusty ground, were 2 stones the size of apples, placed at a distance of about 20 paces from each other. Mackenzie recognized the boy immediately. He was Swift Eagle, son of Braveheart, chief of one of the tribes that traded with him regularly. The boy has always shown exceptional skill with archery, but he had never seen anything like it. On the other side of the square, 3 men watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Mackenzie knew them by sight. They were gunmen who had arrived in the city 2 weeks ago, causing problems in the halls and intimidating local merchants. Their leader, a tall, thin man named Jack Morrison, chewed on a toothpick while laughing softly. Swift Eagle raised the bow with precise and fluid movements. His small hands positioned the arrow with a confidence that impressed any attentive observer. The boy took a deep breath, closed one eye, stared for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, and let go of the rope. The arrow flew through the dry air, cutting through the morning silence. The shell hit the first stone with a dry noise, ricocheted at the perfect angle, and followed its trajectory until it hit the second stone with equal accuracy. The 2 stones rolled across the ground, raising small clouds of golden dust. A murmur of admiration ran through the assembled crowd. Jack Morrison spat the toothpick on the ground and took a few steps towards the center of the square. His 2 companions followed, their hands resting menacingly next to their holsters. The noise of the spurs echoed in the tense silence that had formed. Mackenzie felt a tightness in his chest. I knew that kind of man. I knew that look. Morrison was not the type to accept being outclassed by a child, especially a native child. The merchant knew that this display of skill, which should have been cause for celebration, was about to turn into something very different. The hot wind blew down the main street, kicking up small swirls of dust among the silent observers. Swift Eagle stood motionless in the center of the square, the bow still in his hands, watching the 3 men approach with the natural patience of someone who learned to hunt from a very young age. Morrison stopped a few feet away from the boy. His smile did not reach his stone-cold eyes. The tension in the air became so dense that it seemed possible to touch it with my hands. Morrison moved a few steps closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of dry land. The leather of his vest creaked with every movement, and the metal of his weapon shimmered in the intense sunlight. His eyes scanned the boy from top to bottom, like a predator sizing up its prey. The other residents of the town watched the scene from balconies and windows, but none dared to interfere. Everyone knew the reputation of the 3 outsiders. Everyone knew that men like Morrison had no qualms when it came to proving who was in charge at Red Canyon. Mackenzie stepped forward, stepping out of the shadow of his wagon. His hands remained visible and away from the gun he carried on his belt. He knew the rules of that dangerous game. One wrong word, one too sudden movement, and the situation could explode like dry powder. Swift Eagle maintained his calm and dignified demeanor, Her dark eyes followed Morrison's every move without showing fear or defiance. It was the attitude of someone who grew up respecting nature and its dangers, but who also learned not to back down from them. The silence stretched like a rope about to break. Morrison finally stopped within 3 feet of the boy. He tilted his head slightly to the side, as if he were studying some exotic animal he had never seen before. His lips curled into a smile that was anything but friendly. The gunslinger raised his right hand and pointed to the 2 stones that were still on the ground, where Swift Eagle's arrow had knocked them down. He made a circular gesture with his finger, indicating the entire area around him. Then he pointed to himself and his 2 companions, who had positioned themselves strategically on the sides of the square. The message was clear, even without words. Morrison was proposing some kind of competition. Mackenzie felt the sweat run down her back. He knew that kind of man, and he knew that Morrison was not interested in a fair display of skill. I was looking for an excuse, a justification to humiliate the boy in front of the whole city. Or worse. Swift Eagle tilted his head slightly, a barely perceptible gesture that could be interpreted as acceptance. His fingers moved over the bowstring with the familiarity of years of practice. There was no hurry in his movements, no nervousness, just the serene concentration of someone who completely trusted his abilities. Morrison laughed softly, a harsh sound that echoed through the quiet square. He signaled to his companions, who immediately began to move. One of them went to the nearest wagon and removed 2 empty glass bottles. The other took a rope from the horse's bollard. In a few minutes, they had improvised a target much more complex than 2 stones on the ground. The bottles were hung at different heights, swaying gently in the hot wind. The distance was greater, the degree of difficulty much higher. And more importantly, if Swift Eagle got it wrong, the consequences would probably be much worse than a simple public humiliation. Mackenzie watched Morrison position the bottles with calculated care. The gunslinger wasn't just creating a challenge, he was setting a trap. The bottles were placed at angles that made it nearly impossible to hit both with a single arrow. It was a test designed for failure. The merchant looked around, looking for some sign of support among the locals, but he found only tense faces and averted looks. Everyone understood what was happening, but no one was willing to face 3 gunmen for the sake of a native child. Swift Eagle walked to the new position Morrison had indicated. His bare feet made only a soft whisper over the beaten earth. He stopped, examined the targets for a few moments, then looked straight into Morrison's eyes. It was then that the boy spoke for the first time since it all began. His voice was clear and firm, without any trace of intimidation or doubt. The words echoed through the silent square like distant thunder, charged with a confidence that made Morrison blink his eyes twice in a row. The gunslinger did not expect that. No one expected it. The boy's words hovered in the warm air like the echo of an ancestral challenge. Morrison felt something strange run down his spine, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't fear exactly, but a restlessness that made him instinctively clench the hilt of the gun in his holster. Morrison's 2 companions exchanged nervous glances. They had expected to see intimidation in the child's eyes, perhaps pleas or attempts to escape. But they found only a disturbing serenity, as if Swift Eagle were completely oblivious to the danger that surrounded him. Mackenzie observed the subtle change in the posture of the 3 men. He knew that kind of situation well. I had seen similar moments over the years when the arrogance of some outsiders clashed with the quiet wisdom of the natives. Almost always, the results were surprising. Morrison regained his composure and let out a forced laugh that echoed through the square. He made a broad gesture with his arms, as if he were putting on a show for the silent crowd. His eyes shone with calculated cruelty as he pointed to the 2 bottles swaying in the wind. The gunman then did something that no one expected. He walked to his own gun and unsheathed it with a fluid, practiced motion. The gleaming metal caught the light of the midday sun, sending golden reflections through the walls of the surrounding buildings. Morrison held the gun in his right hand and pointed at the first bottle. The shot echoed like thunder through the silent city. The bottle exploded into thousands of glowing fragments that rained down on the dry land. Morrison spun the gun with aplomb and aimed at the second bottle. Once again, the stampede cut the air. The second bottle instantly disintegrated, leaving only the shards of glass strewn across the floor and the rope dangling empty in the wind. Morrison put the gun back in his holster with a triumphant smile. He made a mocking gesture toward the wreckage on the ground, then looked at Swift Eagle with an expression that mixed defiance and disdain. The message was clear. He had just demonstrated that he could also hit two targets, but with much more destructive power. Mackenzie felt the tension rise even more. Morrison had dramatically raised the level of confrontation. It was no longer just a matter of skill or precision. The gunman was showing his willingness to use lethal violence, a veiled but unambiguous threat. The city dwellers watching from the windows and balconies seemed to have stopped breathing. Some retreated even further into their homes, sensing that the situation was about to take a very dangerous turn. Swift Eagle remained motionless, watching the glass fragments scattered on the floor. His eyes scanned the wreckage for a few seconds, then slowly lifted until they met Morrison's gaze. There was no intimidation in his expression, no anger or defiance, just a deep calm that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his 12. The boy walked a few steps to a specific point in the square. He stopped, surveyed the terrain around him, then nodded as if he had come to some important conclusion. He raised his bow again and placed an arrow on the string. It was then that Mackenzie noticed something that made him frown in concern. Swift Eagle wasn't aiming at any inanimate objects. His arrow was aimed directly at Morrison and one of his companions, who had positioned themselves so that they appeared to be lined up in an almost perfect line when viewed from the angle where the boy stood. The merchant felt the blood run cold in his veins. Morrison also noticed the direction of the crosshair, and his expression changed instantly. The mocking smile disappeared, replaced by a mask of incredulity and growing anger. His muscles tensed like those of an animal about to attack. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was the kind of silence that precedes devastating storms, laden with electricity and terrifying possibilities. The wind stopped blowing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Swift Eagle pulled the bowstring to its maximum tension. His young muscles trembled slightly from the effort, but his aim remained steady and accurate. The boy closed one eye, took a deep breath, and for a moment that seemed eternal, all of Red Canyon was suspended between two heartbeats. Morrison holstered his hand, but something made him hesitate. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment, suspended between life and death. Morrison kept his hand on the handle of the gun, but his fingers could not complete the unsheathing movement. Something in Swift Eagle's eyes had frozen him completely, an absolute certainty that transcended anything the gunslinger had ever faced. Mackenzie watched the scene with his heart racing. In all his years trading in those lands, he had never witnessed a moment of such pure and concentrated tension. It was like watching two forces of nature measure each other up, each representing something far greater than their own individual existences. The third man in the group, who had stayed further away throughout the confrontation, began to move slowly towards his gun. His footsteps were cautious, almost imperceptible, but Swift Eagle caught the peripheral movement without taking his eyes off Morrison. The boy adjusted the position of the bow slightly, and the man stopped instantly, as if he had hit an invisible wall. It was at this point that Mackenzie fully understood what was happening. Swift Eagle wasn't just demonstrating skill with archery. I was teaching a lesson about true power. The boy had realized early on that Morrison and his companions were predators who preyed on the fear of others. And now it was showing that fear could be a two-way street. Sweat ran down Morrison's forehead despite the dry desert air. His eyes moved quickly between the arrow pointed at him and the serene face of the boy who wielded it. For the first time in a long time, the gunslinger was facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his reputation or his threats. The crowd gathered on the balconies and windows watched in absolute silence. Some residents had discreetly opened their doors to get a better look, but no one dared to make any noise that might break the delicate balance of that moment. Swift Eagle kept the arrow taut, but Mackenzie noticed something in the boy's movements that others might miss. There was no malice in his gestures, no thirst for revenge. There was only a show of controlled force, like that of a feline that shows its claws without necessarily attacking. The wind blew again, raising small swirls of dust among the men. The soft roar of air passing through the wooden buildings was the only audible sound in Red Canyon's main square. Even the horses tied to the poles seemed to feel the tension in the air and remained still like statues. Morrison tried to speak, but his voice came out like a hoarse whisper that barely made it through the space between him and the boy. His tongue ran over his parched lips as he tried to regain some trace of the arrogance he had shown just minutes before. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Swift Eagle slightly loosened the tension of the bowstring, lowering the arrow only a few inches. The gesture was minimal, almost imperceptible, but it carried immense meaning. It was a show of mercy, an opportunity for Morrison to step back from the situation without completely losing his dignity. Mackenzie held her breath, waiting to see how the gunslinger would react to this silent offer of truce. Morrison looked around the square, as if he was seeing Red Canyon for the first time. His eyes ran over the tense faces of the residents, the open windows, the half-open doors through which people watched the events unfold. Slowly, very slowly, he began to realize that he had completely underestimated the situation. The gunslinger took a small step back, then another. His companions, noticing the movement, also began to gradually retreat. None of the three drew their weapons. None made sudden or threatening movements. Swift Eagle followed every movement with his dark eyes, holding the bow in position until the three men were at a safe distance. Only then, with the same serenity with which he had begun all that demonstration, did the boy completely relax the rope and lower his weapon. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer charged with mortal tension, but with a kind of mutual recognition. Morrison had learned something about respect. Swift Eagle had proven his point without shedding a drop of blood. Mackenzie felt a wave of relief run through her body, but she knew that the situation was not yet completely over. It remained to be seen how Morrison would react to the humiliation of having recoiled in front of a child, and whether he would be able to accept the lesson or whether he would try to seek some kind of revenge later. The minutes that followed felt like hours on the silent clock of Red Canyon. Morrison stood a few feet away, his eyes still fixed on Swift Eagle, as if he were trying to decipher a mystery that challenged all of his life experience. His two companions flanked him nervously, waiting for some signal of command that did not arrive. Mackenzie observed the subtle transformation that was taking place in the gunman's face. The initial anger had given way to bewilderment, then to what seemed to be a kind of grudging acknowledgement. It was like watching a man rediscover something about himself that he had lost long ago. Swift Eagle calmly put his arrow in the leather quiver he carried on his back. His movements were fluid and natural, without any haste or ostentation. The boy then bent down and began to pick up the larger fragments of glass scattered on the floor, carefully placing them in a small, orderly pile. The simple gesture had a profound impact on the observers. While Morrison had destroyed the targets in a show of brute force, Swift Eagle was cleaning up the mess left behind. It was a silent lesson in responsibility and respect for everyone's shared space. Mackenzie took a few cautious steps toward the center of the square. His eyes remained attentive to the three gunmen, but his instinct told him that the immediate danger had passed. There was something about Morrison's stance that indicated a fundamental change in his attitude. The merchant stopped next to Swift Eagle and also began to help collect the glass fragments. Other residents of the city, realizing that the tension had subsided, began to slowly emerge from their hiding places. First one, then two. Soon a small crowd formed in the main square. An elderly woman brought a broom from her home. A young merchant appeared with a small shovel. An entire family emerged from his shop to take a closer look at the boy who had faced off against 3 gunmen, armed only with bow and arrow. There were no words being exchanged, but there was an energy of community reorganizing itself after a storm. Morrison watched all this movement with an increasingly thoughtful expression. His fingers drummed nervously against his leg, and Mackenzie could almost see the thoughts rearranging behind his gray eyes. The gunslinger had arrived in Red Canyon expecting to find a town easy to intimidate, but he was discovering something completely different. It was then that Morrison did something that surprised even Mackenzie, who thought he had seen it all in his decades in the West. The gunslinger walked slowly towards Swift Eagle. Every step was measured and careful, his hands remaining well away from any weapon. When he got close enough, Morrison knelt on the dry land of the square, standing at the level of the boy's eyes. Mackenzie saw the gunslinger extend his right hand, the same hand that minutes earlier had wielded a loaded gun with hostile intent. But now, he was offering to help collect the glass fragments. It was a silent plea for forgiveness, an admission that he had misjudged both the boy and the whole situation. Swift Eagle stared at the outstretched hand for a few seconds that seemed eternal. His dark eyes studied Morrison's face with the same intensity with which he had assessed the targets before firing. Then, with a small nod of his head, the boy placed some fragments in the gunman's open palm. The simple gesture completely broke the tension that still hung over Red Canyon. Morrison's 2 companions, seeing their leader collaborate in the cleanup, also approached and began to help. Soon, the whole community was working together, residents and outsiders side by side, removing the traces of the confrontation that could have ended in tragedy. Mackenzie smiled discreetly as she watched the scene. He had witnessed something rare and precious in the Wild West, a time when wisdom triumphed over violence, where understanding replaced hostility. Swift Eagle had shown that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating an enemy, but from transforming him into something better. When all the cleanup was complete, Morrison slowly stood up. He looked around the square, then fixed his eyes on Swift Eagle once more. The gunslinger touched the brim of his hat in a respectful gesture, a salute that acknowledged not only the boy's skill, but his superior wisdom. Swift Eagle replied with a slight tilt of the head, the kind of recognition a master gives to a student who has finally understood an important lesson. Then the boy turned and walked calmly toward the exit of town, his bow waving gently in his hand. Mackenzie followed him with his eyes until the little figure disappeared on the dusty trail that led to his tribe's lands. The merchant knew that it would take a long time to forget that morning, and that the story of the confrontation in the main square would be told and retold for many years to come in the evenings around the campfires. Morrison and his companions remained in the square for a few more minutes, as if they were internally processing everything that had happened. When they finally made their way to the local hall, their steps were different, less arrogant, more humble. Something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them and the city. In the weeks that followed, Mackenzie heard reports that the 3 men had completely changed their behavior. Morrison began to treat the locals with respect. His companions stopped bullying the merchants, and all 3 began to contribute positively to the community instead of just taking advantage of it. A few months later, when Mackenzie returned to Red Canyon on one of his regular trading trips, he found that Morrison had decided to settle permanently in the city. The former gunman had opened a repair shop and was using his manual skills to help residents keep their properties in good shape. Mackenzie searched for Morrison and found him working in the scorching sun, fixing the broken wheel of a wagon. The man was sweaty and dusty, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't there before, a peace that comes from finding true purpose. When Morrison saw Mackenzie approaching, he stopped his work and straightened up. The 2 men greeted each other respectfully, and for a few minutes talked about trivial matters, the weather, commerce, the news from other cities. It was only when Mackenzie was preparing to leave that Morrison mentioned Swift Eagle. The former gunman said that he had looked for the boy a few weeks after the incident in the square. He had ridden to the tribe's lands with the intention of formally expressing his respect and gratitude. He found Swift Eagle practicing archery near a stream and watched in silence for several minutes. The boy was hitting impossible targets with an ease that defied explanation. Thin trunks swaying in the wind, leaves falling from the trees, even small stones thrown into the air by other young men of the tribe. Each arrow found its purpose with supernatural precision. But what impressed Morrison most was not the technical skill, but the attitude of Swift Eagle. The boy was not showing off or competing. He was simply practicing his art with the serene dedication of someone who had found his place in the world. Morrison told Mackenzie that at that moment, he fully understood what had happened in Red Canyon Plaza. Swift Eagle wasn't just demonstrating that he could hit 2 targets at once. It was showing that a true warrior knows when to use his strength and when to show it is enough. Mackenzie listened to the story in silence, nodding occasionally. When Morrison finished speaking, the 2 men remained quiet for a few moments, each lost in his own reflections on that extraordinary day. Finally, Mackenzie climbed into his wagon and prepared to continue his journey. As he walked away from Red Canyon, he looked back one last time and saw Morrison returning to his job in the midday sun. The former gunman had found a way to redemption through humility and honest work. Years later, when Mackenzie was too old to make his regular trading trips, he still told the story of Swift Eagle to anyone who would listen. He always ended his narratives with the same reflection. In the Wild West, where brute force often decided matters of life and death, there was something profoundly powerful about discovering that true courage sometimes lay in knowing when not to pull the trigger. The lesson of Swift Eagle would echo through the years, reminding all who would listen that even in the wildest and most unforgiving territory, there was always room for wisdom, mercy, and the possibility of human transformation. If this story of wisdom and transformation has touched your heart, you can't miss our next adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling us what was the most exciting moment of this story for you.